is the last lab in the second unit. We're going to begin with the structures of the sheep brain, covering them in the same order that they're in their lab manual. And we'll begin by looking at the external features of the sheep brain. Here at the upper surface here, this convoluted, highly folded portion is called the cerebrum. Just behind the cerebrum, this other large structure here, is the cerebellum.
Cerebellum.
The two portions of the cerebrum are divided by a groove here.
Divided by a
This
groove.
deep groove is called the great longitudinal fissure. It's between the two hemispheres of the cerebrum.
Great
We
longitudinal
have another fissure which divides the cerebrum from the cerebellum. So just this indentation here, this division line, this would be the transverse fissure.
Transverse fissure.
The cerebrum is divided up into lobes, the same way that you divide up the bones of the skull, and they're named in the same fashion. So we have a frontal lobe.
Front. Oh, we know
Here,
that already.
on each side.
Frontal.
Parietal lobe, sides of the cerebrum.
Parietal.
The temporal lobe is kind of stuck a little bit down underneath here.
Temporal.
And the occipital lobe, which is the back portion of the cerebrum back there beneath the occipital bone.
Occipital.
There's also a central fissure, which is a little difficult to see on a sheep's brain. It's a structure which is pretty remarkable on a human brain, but on a sheep's brain it's kind of indefinite. But basically it's a dividing line between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. I think on this brain our central fissure would be right along in this groove, not as deep as the other fissures. Addition from the outside, we can see the pons and the medulla. I'm going to flip the brain over here so that we can see those structures on the lower portion here. Looking at an inferior view of the sheep's brain right now. The pons actually at this moment is partially covered by this flap of tissue right here, but these enlargements right here would be the region of the pons.
The pons.
And just behind it, this other enlargement area right here until it turns into the spinal cord and continues on out. This region would be the medulla oblongata.
Medulla oblongata.
Okay, having located those external structures, we're now going to look at the internal structures. We're going to take a sagittal section, so you're going to cut your sheep's brains right down through the great longitudinal fissure. You're going to continue your incision right through the cerebellum and down through the spinal cord so that we fold the brain open into two halves. When you make this cut, you want to do it with a minimum amount of back and forth sawing that you can possibly do. Try to make the cut just a nice, sharp, smooth cut, one single cut if you possibly can. I've got a brain here that we have already open, and we'll take a look at the insides of this. So we're looking at an inferior view right now. I'll turn it back over to the superior view. It'll fall in half like this when you've made your cut. Okay, looking at the halves here, we can see that on the inside of the cerebellum, here's the cerebellum in the sagittal section, we can see that there's two kinds of material in the cerebellum. There's this darker outer gray matter, and then there's a branch pattern of white matter.
White matter.
The branching pattern of the white matter is called the arbor vitae. It means tree of life. It's a branching tree-like pattern.
Tree of life.
We look more up into the regions of the cerebrum here. I'm actually going to switch halves on us here. This one might show better what I want to look at here. There are cavities in the cerebrum, in the brain. One of the cavities would be right here in this half. As I open up this opening, this is called the lateral ventricle. There are two lateral ventricles. So there's one in this hemisphere of the cerebrum. There's also one in the other hemisphere. The third ventricle then would be a region below this, which if I pull this apart a little bit in here, we can see some of this brownish material is actually within that other ventricle. So there's another cavity or another space right there where the probe is running. We've actually sectioned through the third ventricle, right through the center of it. So we have a half of it in this hemisphere and the other half of it's over there. So it actually comes down and actually surrounds this entire region. This large structure here passes right through the center of that third ventricle. So if we keep following on down this direction, we'll come to the fourth ventricle, and the fourth ventricle is along this little channel right here, and as it turns into the cerebellum rather here, there's a little opening, and that other opening right in there, that extra little channel into there, would be the fourth ventricle.
Fourth ventricle.
Okay, going back up here, we're going to look at the corpus callosum. I think I'm going to switch this back again. Look at this one, a little better here. Here's the corpus callosum. It's a band of white matter. It's a white matter fiber tract that connects between the two hemispheres. So we can see it on both halves. It just happens to be a little more defined
Corpus
on the
callosum.
half. That's the corpus callosum. Extending off from the back end of the corpus callosum and coming forward, a little tongue sort of. I'm going to open up the ventricle on the side so we can see where we're at.
So it would have been nice if she stuck with the previous one. It was actually better.
Lateral ventricle.
You guys see your lateral
This
ventricle?
membrane.
Under its brain, so you know your that little space is your lateral ventricle. The little band above
Lateral
the lateral ventricle is the corpus callosum. And this little tiny one right here below the lateral ventricle, that's the fornix.
Below
So she's going to
the
go back to the other half. You'll see it a lot
fornix?
more clear. She should have stayed with the other
You can
half.
see the fornix coming down this direction, off the back end. The corpus callosum comes up and around, and the fornix comes downward. Possibly
fornix.
we'll have to switch back on that one. I'm going to have to go back and forth between these a little bit so that we can see. This shows it quite well, actually. There's the corpus callosum. And then this white projection
Corpus
coming down here
callosum.
would be the fornix. And the lateral ventricle would be
Fornix.
up inside there. We have an aqueduct of Sylvius, which connects from the third ventricle, this area down
Aqueduct
here,
of
down to the
Sylvius
fourth
is not in your
ventricle.
lab
It
menu.
runs from out of the third ventricle, behind this large lump right here, we'll name that in a minute, comes straight down through here, and this passageway up until the fourth ventricle. The entire passageway is called the aqueduct of Sylvius, or the cerebral aqueduct. That channel through there connects the third and fourth ventricle. Mammillary body is a structure which we can see from the outside as well. I'll go back and show you that on the outside view, but we can see it internally here as a
So there's
structure
your
that's been
optic nerve.
sectioned in half right there.
There's your mammillary body. Okay, so if you turn your brain upside down, you
And
can see a
we
little
review
bump.
through the
Here's
cranial
your-
nerves on the
here's your
outside. I'll
optic
show you
nerve.
again where it is on the outside.
bump on the
Compare
outside
that
is the
location
mammillary
to
body.
this inside location for the mammillary
That's
body.
how it looks like if you from a
Optic
The
satellite.
pineal body is quite a bit larger in sheep than it is in human relative to the proportional size of the brain.
There's your
This other
fornix.
round structure
There's
right
your
here.
third ventricle. There's
This
your
is one
pineal
half of
body.
it we sliced